It's my honor and privilege to introduce our next speaker, and I'm just going to introduce from the heart, and that our next speaker is Dr. Jim Coffield. And this is a gentleman that God has used to really bless our staff in ways that are very precious. There's a lot of, you exert all of who you are in the realm of, in the ministry of disaster response. And so that involves not just the physical labor, but there's also that mental and emotional, that spiritual dynamic that's involved in that as well. And so one of the areas of ministry that we have been praying about for a number of years of really expanding and teaching and developing is that of emotional and spiritual care. And that's in two realms. One is how to do that in the context of our working with those who have been impacted by disasters. And the other piece of that is the care for the caregivers, being able to provide emotional and spiritual care for our staff and volunteers, for police officers and firefighters and other EMA officials and those kind of folks that are boots on the ground that are giving the care, because it does take a toll, because you're sympathetic and somewhat empathetic with those who've been affected by disasters. In fact, right now, tonight, one of my site managers at one of my 4 sites in South Carolina he's from the Philly area. It's a guy named Bill Jones. Some of you know him. He's actually been personally flooded out of his home 3 times. He got flooded and moved, and got flooded and moved, and got flooded and moved. And he's been my #1 site manager at every single flood event that we've ever had. Talk about somebody that can be empathetic to someone who's been flooded out. There you have it. But Jim Coffield has done a masterful work with our staff in providing encouragement, reminding us of those principles from the Word that are so important, so that we don't become part of the disaster in somebody else's life. And so he's the head of the counseling, somebody's laughing when I said that. He's the head of the counseling program at RTS campus for Orlando. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Jim. And he's got like the best stories in the world and a most wonderful son that you're going to learn about. So take it away, Jim.
Thank you all so much. Would it be okay if I just stayed on the floor here? Because I spit when I talk, and I want to try to hit you all better. If I stay up there, you just don't have a way out. It is a privilege to be here. I kind of feel like you hired John Wayne and Barney Fife to teach y'all how to shoot. And John Wayne just finished. And so you're left with Barney Fife. I mean, he's my boss. Ligon Duncan's my boss at RTS Orlando. And so he's kind of the guy in charge of all the RTS campuses. So I was just kind of impressed that I'd be. So that's why I'm not going to be on the same platform. I'll just be down here. But it is a privilege to be here with you. I'd like to start by just telling you a story. I want to introduce somebody to you that you'll never hear from, you'll never recognize his name, and until you get to heaven, you won't hear his name again after tonight. And none of you probably have ever heard his name before. His name is Morris Bagwell, and Morris Bagwell is the worst preacher I have ever heard in my life. He came from a Pentecostal background, and if you know anything about our Pentecostal brothers and sisters, a good sermon is not one you planned. A good sermon is something that came to you at 5 in the morning of that morning service. And so what would happen is every week Morris would get up at 5 in the morning, and he always started every sermon by saying, I was going to speak about so-and-so. But this morning at 5 o'clock, the Lord told me this. And I tell you, the Lord may have told him, but he did not tell him how to speak, because it was never good. And it was probably the worst preaching I've ever heard. But one of the greatest questions of my life, God used him in my life. My father, I grew up in a family that was not a Christian family. I don't know what your mysteries are. You're wondering about in your life. It might be a crisis that's happened. It might be a trauma. It might be, if you were in South Carolina right now, that your house is flooded. I'm not sure what your mystery is, but one of my mysteries was my father's salvation. Grew up in a non-Christian home, and my father, I never knew about his faith, although we talked about it a lot. My dad died about 19 years ago now. We were he had Alzheimer's, and And we had moved back to try to be near him while he was dying, and he was having a pretty rough go. It was toward the end. We knew it was toward the end of his life. And I would go over to the Baptist Hospital in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I would visit with him. And he grew up in Lower Alabama. Matter of fact, I was born in Opelika. I know that may be bad news for you Alabama people, but he, and so in his hospital room, I used to play cassette tapes of old hymns, old Southern hymns, thinking that may be triggering something that might be heard when he was a boy growing up in Alabama, hoping that maybe something would stir in the mind that was only halfway there with Alzheimer's as he was dying. And so I remember the last few weeks of his life. It was an afternoon. I'd spent the night there, and the nurse came in, and I must have looked pretty bad. She said, "Why don't you go on home? I think he's doing okay for a while." And so I decided to go home, and I happened to work on staff of the church where Morris Bagwell was the senior pastor. And I was working my way. I was a graduate student finishing up school, and I worked doing counseling and working with his church. And Morris Bagwell, the worst preacher in the history of Christendom, was my senior pastor. And so I came home. Stay with me for a minute. There's a point to this story. A lot of my stories don't have a point, but this one does, so just stay with me for a minute. So I come home from the hospital, and I look in the yard. I mean, a family of pygmies could be living in my house. I mean, I just hadn't had time to take care of things, and so I told Mona, I said, I'm just going to go cut the grass, and so I went out and I started cutting the grass, and about halfway through the job, Mona came out and said, "Hospital's on the phone. They want to talk to you." Well, you know. You just know what's about, you know. And so I go inside, and I get on the phone, and they said, "Well, you need to come on down to the hospital right now." And I said, has he died? She said, "Well, you just need to come on down." They wouldn't tell me, but I knew. My dad had passed away. And with all of my questions of his faith and all the tiredness that goes with all that, I don't know what your traumas are. I don't know what your struggles are. I don't know what make you question God sometimes, but I remember that was one of mine for me. And so I didn't even change clothes. I left the lawnmower out in the yard, and it just said, "No, I've got to. I think my dad's died." And she said, "Well, I'll go down." So I get in the car and say, "Listen, call Morris. Just call Morris if you would. Tell him that my dad passed away, and just let him know." So I get in the car, drive to the hospital. Mona meets me there a few minutes later. We find some neighbors to watch our kids, and about an hour later, Morris Bagwell shows up at church. He shows up at the hospital. He stays with me the rest of the day. Goes over with us to the funeral home. He walks us through some of that stuff with us, and just was with us all day. When I got home, late that night, there's a red cooler in front of my house full of food. The yard's been cut by Morris Bagwell. The worst preacher in the history of evangelical Christianity stood for Christ in a time in my life that I'll never forget. And so I have the questions in my soul: is God good? Can I trust God with my dad? Can I trust God with my dad? My dad's dead. Will I see him in heaven? Can I trust God with that? And the way sometimes God doesn't always answer those why questions, but often the way he answers that was with the presence of a person. And there's a way in which I think of that story, and I think of Morris Bagwell, and I can think if God had gone to the trouble to bring Morris Bagwell to my house, to cut my grass, show up at my house, and bring me food, then come and comfort me, if a God would go to that kind of trouble, I think I could trust a God like that. that flashbulb memories, those memories that come in trauma, are actually stored at a different place in your brain than regular memories. And to think, when someone's in a crisis, why should we show up? Why should we be present? Because for the rest of their life, when they remember that moment, and most people only have 4 or 5 of those moments in their lifetime. Most people have 5 or 6 times in their life where something like their house is burned down, or their house is flooded, or there's an unexpected death, or there's a trauma. There's usually only 4 or 5 of those events in a lifetime. And you show up in that moment. In the name of Christ, you show up in that moment, and you have permanently placed in their memory, I can't think of my father's death without thinking of Morris Bagwell cutting my grass. I can't think of my father's death without thinking about that red cooler in front of our full of food. I can't think of it without knowing that Christ was represented in my home, in my time, with my big questions, not with good theology, not with someone explaining why my dad never really listened to me, or all the other things that, in terms about faith. God did not answer the question of, are you good, God? Can I trust you even in spite of this? He didn't answer that question with theology. He answered that with a person who showed up in the name of Christ. My job tonight is to somehow begin to think how we should do that. How should we do that? What do people need? And I just want to tell you, the main question people have in those times when they question God's goodness, don't bother them with your quick, easy solution theology that just says it's all going to be better, or God makes lemonade out of lemons, or those sort of platitudes. Those aren't very helpful. But your presence will make a difference. The way that God seemed to redeem this world was through the incarnation. He showed up. And in his showing up, he says to a world, he doesn't always answer all our questions of whys. There's a lot of confusion. But he shows up. And it's his presence. And that's what he promises, right? Remember when Jesus says, I'll be with you always, even to the ends of the earth. His promise is not that I'll help you figure it all out. His promise, you won't be alone. And that's why you should have a mercy ministry. That's why you ought to be involved with disaster relief. Because you're showing up and people are raw. And they'll remember those events. They'll remember, like I said, those are what researchers call flashbulb memories. People remember those with such level of specificity. They'll remember the clothes people wore. They'll remember the smell. They'll remember the sights. Because people only have a few of those in their lifetime. And if you're there caring for them, then someone who loves Christ, someone who stands for Christ, is in that memory permanently, representing Christ as they replay that in their mind, trying to figure out, why'd that happen? Why'd that happen? So I guess the first thing I want to do tonight is introduce you to Morris Bagwell and tell you that the worst preacher I've ever met was one of the finest shepherds I'd ever met. It was a good pastor. Because when I wonder if God's good enough, because really the essence of all sin is a belief that God's not good enough, that God's not good. When I wrestle with that, can I trust God with the biggest questions of my life? God put a person there who loves him. So, with that as our starting spot, we're going to look at a passage together. Now, if you want to think about it, where could we look for, you've got to be careful. You don't want to be prescriptive. We're going to look at a story of Jesus when he shows up in a crisis. But it's not prescriptive. That doesn't mean, in this text, you'll see that Jesus is moved twice to tears in the story. Well, that means, okay, well, I'm supposed to cry twice. No, you don't. In one sense, if you want a biblical context of how you should care, just read the Gospels. Because essentially, the incarnation, Christ coming, is him coming into crisis. The world is in crisis. Sin has, and the world needs to be redeemed back unto himself. And if you look at the way Jesus deals with people in the Gospels, you will see someone entering in a crisis situation, I mean, spiritually speaking. But there's the story, I'm going to just spend a few minutes on it. And again, I'm not going to look at it the way a good teacher, a good pastor, like your pastor would look at this in a very different way. And I don't want to be cavalier with Scripture. And this passage is not primarily about disaster relief or crisis intervention, but it is a picture of when Christ comes in on a crisis situation. It's a story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. And he comes into a crisis situation. So I'll tell you what, could we do something really quick? Could we just pray really quick before we look at that together? And then I'm just going to try to give you some principles. And my goal will be to finish by midnight. And if that's okay with you, we're good. We're good. I'll get to finish a little bit early because Ligon finished early, and that'll be good. So I'm going to try not to bore you. But if you'll stick with me, I think I have something for us to look at together. But let's pray together if we could. Father, what would it be if 2,000 years from now, in eternity, there are stories told about the people in this room and the way they stood for you in times of crisis? Father, I humbly ask that the time tonight and tomorrow in these rooms would be times used for your glory and for such purposes, that you would weave the lives in this room into your great story of redemption and the lives and those situations that they will be taken to. Father, I pray that you would enliven in this room a commitment in these churches to anticipate and hope for such stories. Not because we hope for crisis. It's just on this side of heaven, crisis is inevitable. Instead, give us a passion, a hope that we would have that great privilege to stand for you in those memories, in those times, in those places. Father, give us the courage to roll up our sleeves and get dirt under our fingernails. And somehow that dirt and that sweat could be for your glory and for your great purposes. For the people in this room, the too comfortable, would you use our time this weekend together to disrupt them? For the people that are disrupted, would you use this time to comfort them? We pray in the powerful, powerful name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right. You know, if you want a happy ending, you've got to be careful where you stop the story. Because all good stories, if stopped at the wrong time, are tragedies. I mean, every good story, if you stop it too early, is a tragedy. I mean, think of every good story you know. If you stop it too early, if you don't trust the author to finish the story, if you pull out the last 5 pages, this incredible epic story of redemption is just a sad tragedy. Or a cynic might call it a comic. But God is a great author. He's a great author, and he is telling amazing stories of redemption. It's ultimately his story. You know, you've really only got 2 choices in life. You can either work really hard to tell your story, and you could be the star of your story. And that story will last about 70 years, and it'll be forgotten a decade later, maybe 2. Or you can realize there's a grand meta-narrative of redemption that God is telling, a grand story that he is telling Now, the problem is the star of that story has already been cast. The star of that story is Jesus. But you can either have a bit but important part in his grand story, or you can tell a worthless story that'll be forgotten in a decade. And that's what you should be about as you think about what you're going to be doing. Well, the story we're going to look at is the story of Lazarus. And it's found in John. You're so familiar with the story. It's John 11, and I'm just going to read a couple of things, and then we're going to go through a few things that you might want to think about. I'm going to skip to verse 17. You know the story. The story is people. They come to Jesus. These are Jesus' friends. They come to Jesus and say, Lazarus is sick. You've got to come help him. And Jesus doesn't come quickly and waits. And then finally, Jesus comes. In verse 17, on his arrival, Jesus found Lazarus was already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them at the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. Notice there's confusion. If you're going to serve God in the midst of trauma, understand that God is a relational God. He's a mysterious God in some ways. And he's a redeeming God. Because there's a lot of confusion at the beginning of this story. And there's even the implication that Mary and Martha are pretty disappointed, especially Mary. Mary doesn't even come out to see Jesus at first. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, he went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to him, if you'd only been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Oh, yes, Lord. She told him, I believe that you are the Christ and the Son of God who has come into the world. I'll be real quick here. Just stay with me. I just want to get the whole story. Just stay with me for just another minute or two, if you will. After this, she said, after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and he's asking for you. Remember that. Just a side note, but remember that Jesus was asking for her. We'll talk about that in a minute. When Mary heard this, she got up, quickly went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still in the place where Mary had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforted her and noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to mourn. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her were also weeping, he was deeply moved. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He said. Come and see, Lord, they replied, and Jesus cried. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him? But some of them said, could not he have opened the eyes of the blind man and could not have kept him from dying? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. Once more he was deeply moved. Notice that. Came to the tomb. It was a cave. The stone had been laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by the time there'll be a bad odor, and he's been there for 4 days. And Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? We're almost finished. Stay with me. So they took away the stone. Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you for that you have heard me. I know you always hear me, but I say this on the benefit of the people standing here, that you may believe that they sent you. When he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Just a couple of thoughts as we think about this story together. What do people need? In a word, and Ligon Duncan, so much smarter than I am, he said it so well when he talked about the dignity. People need to be given dignity in times like this. I've been visiting an acquaintance, a friend, who was convicted of prison, and he's serving 2 years in prison in Florida. And maybe if I were a better Christian, I could tell you I've been in lots of prisons in my life, and I've been involved in prison ministry and helped people and that sort of stuff. But to be honest with you, I probably haven't spent that much time in prison. But what's missing, I've gone to visit him now 6 or 7 times. And what's amazing is when I go in and there's no dignity. No one looks at each other in the eye. I stand there and they make sure I can only bring in my car key and an ID. And they search me, and I have to take everything off. They search me, and they write everything down I have, and then they parade me into the room, and I go and I sit down, and then I wait for them to bring him in. And we're in this big room where the prisoners sit on one side of the table and the visitors sit on the other, and it is a room with no dignity. And it's palatable. And I sit and as I watch and I look at the look in his eyes and the look of the other people in the eyes, that there's something about as they sit there, they have an image bearer of God, no matter how horrific whatever they've done is. They're supposed to be given some modicum of dignity. And when everything you own is flooded, a few things you have are in boxes. When when your house is burned down or a hurricane's come through and you feel like you're just helpless. One of the life-giving things is for someone to look them in the eye and offer them the dignity that is ultimately ascribed to them by being an image bearer of God. As they stand there and they say, everything I've worked for is gone. I've got nothing. Our house is destroyed. I'm a fool. What have I done? And someone who stands for Christ looks them in the eye and gives them the dignity that is ascribed to someone who has the image of God in their very thumbprint of their design. There's something about them that changes in that moment. It's hope-giving. See, my hope is not in the fact that my house is strong enough or big enough or built enough. When all your stuff is gone, when things don't work the way you'd hope they do, your hope is not in your stuff. Your hope is in the idea that maybe we're not just animals, and maybe there's a greater purpose, and maybe there's something more. Maybe it wasn't just happenstance. Maybe there's more than just a crapshoot of life. And that's given by dignity. That's given with dignity. So when I think about how I want you to engage people in this journey of mercy that God's called you on, the first thing is to do that with dignity. And you see that in the way Jesus deals with people. You see, especially you look in the Gospel of Luke, one of my favorite Gospels. It's kind of an upside down gospel. The wrong people are doing the right thing. I mean, the shepherds become the people that see the incarnation, and I mean, it's just full of kind of people that are just a mess, being treated with great dignity. I think the only people that you see Jesus not dealing with that sense of a look in the eye, you matter, because he did that with children, he did that with women. Back in that day, it was scandalous, the kindness he offered to women and children. to talk to the woman at the well, to talk to the woman caught in adultery, to talk to children, to say to the disciples, to say to the disciples, to even be indignant and say to the disciples, no, let the children come to me. I mean, that's dignity giving. And dignity has a way of sticking with a person. Because that's what we were made for. Satan is committed to taking that away from you. He's committed to making you feel like you're an animal and that life is random and things don't matter. See, God's story is about connection, relationship, and redemption, and pouring out. And Satan's story is about isolation, stealing and robbing and taking and animalistic. And so the first thing I would want to suggest to you as you read the Gospels is look at the way that the dignity that God chooses to engage his creation with. It's humbling the way God deals with us when you read the Gospel. It's humbling because he didn't have to treat us that way. Well, first thing I would want you to notice, how do you show dignity? Well, you show dignity by showing up. You show dignity by listening. Even in this story, if you'll notice with Jesus, he does listen and doesn't just tell people stuff. As a matter of fact, he doesn't engage the question. Remember when the Jews asked the question, and why Jesus would let people ask this question and not answer it? The Jews were asking the question, they saw how much Jesus cared about Lazarus. They saw him drawn to tears. And the Jews watching said, boy, he sure did care about him. And then they asked the theological question, if God can save these people, or in this case, literally, if God can let the blind people see, if he can heal the blind, surely he could have done this. Why didn't he? They were asking a theological question. Jesus doesn't engage the theological question. But he lives before them in such a way where they said, their comment was, wow, this guy, I mean, this is my translation of it. Wow, this guy really did care. He's brought to tears. He really cares. Now then they backed up and asked a theological question. Jesus doesn't answer that theological question. Sometimes God doesn't answer the whys the way we like. Don't go into disaster relief thinking you're going to explain to somebody why a tornado hit their house and not their neighbor across the street, because you can't answer that one. I used to think I was going to be able to answer all the questions. I mean, I'm a professor. I'm a seminary professor. And I had an autistic son. I haven't been able to answer a lot of those questions. And maybe I'm not supposed to. Maybe the real healing doesn't come from a good answer, but from the presence of Christ himself in the situation. At least that's what this text would suggest. So the first thing I would suggest is dignity, and then I say how you give the dignity, you listen. Also, notice the way Jesus not only listened, he also pursued. He asked for Mary. Now, he knows Mary's mad at him. Or it's implied in the text that Mary's mad. She didn't come out. And so Martha has to go back and says to Mary, he's asking for you. So evidently when Martha came out, he said, how's Mary? How's she handling this? Is she okay? Note his care. Note that it was assertive care. When you care for people in tragedy, make sure that you're not telling them what to do. You're not making the decisions for them, but don't do things as foolish as, well, if you need anything, let us know. Well, listen, if you ever need anything, call us. Don't bother. Don't even bother saying that to people, because they're not going to call you. And the people who will call you, they probably didn't need you. Instead say, listen, we're going to show up with food unless you tell us not to. listen, we're going to help here unless there's something else you want to do. But notice the assertiveness in which Jesus relationally tried to connect. He asked for Mary. Also, notice that Jesus was moved. Twice in this text, Jesus is moved. Now, there's a real thing in my field, counseling field. They kind of teach you to act like you don't care. And so you guys can be real clinical. So it sounds like you're having some difficulty in your marriage. And they kind of teach you how to kind of be real clinical. Well, I want to tell you, the problem with that is it makes life not very messy, but you don't really help anybody that way. You want to have a good ministry? You want to have a life that's not messy? You can do that. It just won't be much of a ministry. One of my favorite proverbs, in the book of Proverbs, where it says, where there are oxen, the barn is clean where there are no oxen, but with oxen there is great harvest. You think, so what are you saying? What are you saying? But good Alabama people know what that means. They know that you can, if you want to have a clean barn, you can have a clean barn. Just don't have any oxen or cattle or anything in the barn. But with your clean barn, you won't get much of a harvest. If you have oxen, you'll have quite a harvest. You want to have a great ministry that's not messy? That's great, do that. Don't get involved in disaster relief. Don't love anybody, and you can have clean barns. You just won't do anything. Because real love is always a messy thing. But can you think of something better to get messy about than the fact that you could stand for Christ for the rest of somebody's life? So, notice the assertive nature. Notice that he listened. Notice the assertive nature in which Jesus engaged with people. Notice that he became emotionally connected with the people. He allowed their hurts to bother him. Matter of fact, the text, a careful reading of the original text would suggest that he even got annoyed that I guess it was that the people believed this was the end. It's almost as if this is how people are ending the story. This isn't how the story ends for Lazarus. This isn't how the story ends at all. There's a sadness. Jesus weeps. And so when you go out to care for people in crisis, have the courage to weep with them. Have the courage to listen to them. Have the courage to be sad with them. Have the courage to, more important than getting your task done, might be to just listen to them. Oh, I bet you it was so hard when the water was coming up. What was that like for you? I'm sorry. And listen, because their stories matter. We know that when people have post-traumatic stress disorder, it's just a fancy term people use today. It's been around forever. Your grandparents would have called it combat fatigue. But it's what happens when people have been traumatized and their kind of emotions get kind of stuck inside of them. You know how people get better? When they tell the stories. If it gets stuck inside of them, that's kind of the essence of that. You know, back in World War II, there were less PTSD than there is now. Think why? We had more mental health people now than we did then. We know more than we did then. Why would that be the case? Well, it's because they transported the troops in ships back then. So after they were in war, they would come back together as a team, and they would tell the stories. They would tell the horrific stories, and they would talk about their fallen friends they'd lost, and they'd weep together, and they'd tell their stories together as they came back. What happened in the more recent wars, that you can be you could be in Afghanistan, and then your time's up, and you're pulled out of the unit, and you're 48 hours later, you're on stateside in a mall, And we go, I wonder why everybody's having PTSD? Because they're not telling their stories. So you listen to them tell their stories. So we're giving dignity. We're listening. We're assertive in the way that we do that, where, he asked for Mary. We allow ourselves to be emotional with the people. We allow ourselves to be connected emotionally. Now, don't misunderstand. There is a point where you can get too emotional, and therefore you're not going to be any good to somebody. There is a balance to that. If you get so emotional, you see, Jesus did not throw away what he was doing and then run to help Mary and Martha when he first heard. He waited. So he wasn't, emotion didn't run the day, but he has allowed himself, the emotions of others, to matter to him and for him to be impacted by that and to let them see that he was impacted by that. That's incredibly powerful to somebody. So not only did we notice also, see, people in trauma tend to get numb. And that's why it's healing for them to see someone with emotion. The truth is, in trauma, often people do pretty well initially. Because part of it is they get kind of numb, and they kind of go into they don't know what all they've lost yet. They sometimes, but they get numb and get discouraged. And so one of the healing things that can happen is when somebody comes in and feels for them and feels with them, and there's something very healing about that. It kind of gets them back in the present as opposed to kind of in this numb denial and it allows them to deal with reality when people are there to help them as opposed to dealing with it 6 weeks later when no one's there. Notice also that Jesus allowed the people to do a task with him. Jesus said to him, this is kind of interesting. There's 2 tasks in the story of Lazarus that Jesus asked other people to do. What were they? Unbind him at the end. He was in grave clothes. And what else? Move the stone. Now, if you're about to raise someone from the dead, you could probably move a stone. I'm just saying. And if you're about to raise somebody from the dead, I'll bet you can get their grave clothes just to fall right off of them. I'm just saying. One's a bigger miracle than the other. I would put, not that we're measuring miracles here, but I'm guessing moving a stone is a 3, and I'm guessing raising some of the dead's an 8. And I would get having grave clothes fall off somebody, that's a 2. So it's not that Jesus was tired or Jesus couldn't ask his Father to do more. So what did he do? He got the people involved as he did that. Now again, please don't misunderstand. This is bad use of the Bible. I'm not suggesting that this text is a prescription on how to deal with crisis. I'm just saying, look at the way Jesus deals with people in crisis, and let's see if there's some broad principles we could maybe just think about. So don't misunderstand. Ligon I'd lose my job if he thought I was saying that we're being prescriptive with this text. And I don't mean that at all. I'm just saying that Jesus did ask the people to be involved in the task. How can he help? Would you all move the stone? Okay, you all, this is done, you take care of that. Why? That gives dignity. It gives dignity to not patronize someone and do everything for them, but to do something with them. People don't want to be, people want to do as much as they can. That gives dignity. And so if you come in and just say, okay, we'll take care of it, thanks, we'll be back. It takes away their dignity. There's an old classic study, just a fascinating study in psychology, where what they did is they took 2 floors, this is one of those stories. It's just an interesting story. And if nothing else, if I've bored you for the last few minutes, this is just an interesting story to tell somebody about it, tomorrow. So just an old classic study where they took 2 floors of a home for the elderly, a senior citizens home. And they did a really simple study. On both floors, they gave each participant, each person, they put them a flower in a potted plant flower in their room. And on one floor, they said, we put a potted plant in there for you. Don't worry, we'll take care of it for you. The nurse every day will take care of it, and we'll do that. It is for your enjoyment in the room, to liven up your room because we care about you. The other, very simple, same plant, same type of plant, and they said, we've given you a plant. It's your responsibility to take care of it. If you need any help taking care of it, there are supplies. We'll be glad to help. It's your plant. Then they measured the well-being of the people on the 2 floors weeks later. And you think, now come on, couldn't be much difference. Yes. The group that was given some dignity and responsibility, they as a group were closer. Their happiness level was higher. There was less crisis on the floor. And you think, just from that simple thing, what's the dignity? It's the dignity of having somebody involved. And you see the wisdom in that in Jesus. You just see him saying, hey, would you guys move the stone? And would you guys help him with because there's something about that all of a sudden, we won't know these people till we get to heaven. When we get to heaven, let's go find the guys that moved the stone. But I'll bet you they'll be talking about it. I'll bet you 2,000 years from now, you'll find them. They'll go, we were there. We were there. Jesus was there. He said, move the stone. And about 5 of us, we were pushing on that big stone. And they'll tell the story because now they were a participant in a grand narrative of redemption. See, and you are too. And so you invite people to tell that story, to be involved. So you allow people to participate in the act. So you listen to the story, you make contact, you be present emotionally, you include them in the task. You help them make decisions, but you don't push. You help them make decisions because I think of Morris Bagwell. He helped me when we were sitting there, and the person was asking about what kind of coffin and all the things for my dad. He'd been through that enough times as a pastor, and he sat me and he said, and he helped me with that, but he didn't make the decisions for me. He didn't push me, but he walked with me through that process. Don't be a theologian. Don't get too advice. But live it out in front of them. Where do you see that in this text? Remember, Jesus says the prayer, and he says, basically, I'm saying this prayer out loud so that they'll hear you and believe. They'll hear me and believe. There's a way in which he's living out before them what he's doing. So instead of living it out with words, let me explain everything to everybody. I'll live it out in action so that people will see it. There's kind of and you help people live in truth. So how do you help people in crisis live in truth? Well, you don't minimize. Oh, it's not that big a deal. We can fix it. No, to them it's a big deal. You don't know. You don't know what all they've lost. You don't know how they feel. And so you don't minimize. You don't patronize. People, don't you hate it when you're patronized? Oh, you're going to be okay. Don't tell them that you understand. Show them that you care. There's a big difference. And then if you show them you care, they'll know you understand. But if you tell them you understand, you'll lose them. Don't minimize. And help them live in the truth. Ultimately, those are the places where I think God would invite us to begin to think about how people would need our dignity. Quickly, let me just say, I'm going to finish up in about 5 minutes, so just stay with me. Quickly, with dignity, do this care, and do it in a way that's humble. One of the things you'll notice is that to the level that people sacrifice is to the level that they believe in they're entitled if Christ doesn't intervene. And so when you start sacrificing a lot for other people, if you're not careful, you'll start feeling a little entitled. And then you need help Christ let you intervene in that so that you stay humble. That you're humble with people. It is amazing. The Christian, in our culture, it seems as if the Christian view is on defense lately. We're all defending ourselves all the time. We're defending what we believe. And part of that is that how do we get on the offense? And I think we do it by humbly sacrificing and engaging for our culture, for others. Because that always surprises people. They don't know what to do with that. Remember that we live in a world where everybody's a little bit confused. And when they're in crisis, they don't really fully understand. I got a bunch of stories. Let's just tell you one until we start to end. I took my son, Skylar. My son is kind of forever 7 years old. And so last year, to give my wife a break from taking care of him in some ways, he and I went on a cruise together. We went on a 3-day cruise out of Port Canaveral. We live in Orlando. And it was a goat rodeo. I mean, it was absolutely a fiasco at times. But we did everything. I mean, all the lights flashing all the time. I mean, we did everything. We swam with dolphins. Of course, the dolphin scared him, and we didn't stay with the dolphin very long, but we were there. We did everything. We got to where people on the ship kind of knew us, because we would sometimes make noises that weren't always appropriate, and so we're on this boat. Well, it was Saturday night. I guess it was Sunday night, and we were getting ready to go to eat or something. That's basically. If you've never been on a cruise, basically it is just a gluttony fest. Is what it is. And so we were getting ready to go eat because we'd left the last meal, and now we came back to our room for a minute so that we could get ready to go to the next. And he went into the bathroom. And if any of you have been on a cruise ship here? The bathroom there's a fine line between an old phone booth and a bathroom on a cruise ship. They're pretty small. And Skylar shut the door, and it locks from the inside. And he locked it, and he couldn't undo it. And he started to get scared. And he started banging on the door, and started screaming. And then I was pretty sure someone was going to come down pretty quick. And he's really scared. And I'm trying to talk him down. I said, Skylar, I can't open the door. He goes, I can't get out. Why have you locked the door? And I said, I didn't lock the door. And he's panicking. He's emotionally flooding, if you know what I mean by that. I mean, he was just, he's 7 emotionally. And so he's just, finally, it seemed like an hour, but it was probably more like 10 minutes. We finally calm him down enough. And, I kind of talk him through. We kind of get the door unlocked. The door's unlocked. He comes bursting out of the room, and he goes, now, to put this in context, I've just given my vacation time. I'm not a very good father, but I'm married to a really good wife who's a good mother to him. But I'd just given up my vacation. I've spent the last 2.5 days basically following a 7-year-old around a ship, whatever we were wanting to do, and had spent a bucket of money. And he comes out of the room, and he looks at me, and he's just livid. And he looks at me and goes, "You never do anything for me." Now, when you do crisis intervention, what you're going to find is that people who have been sustained by God in a society that's got more blessings and because of God's creation grace, if you will, have incredible blessings and food and hope, and they've been sustained, and every day they've been given a breath from God that they didn't deserve or don't, and instead of being thankful for that, they're confused, they're afraid, and when something happens like their house falls in or there's a crisis that seems bigger than they don't understand it, and they feel like they're just locked in a room and they don't understand it, and they believe that it is God who's against them, when it is God who's the only one for them. And when the door comes open and they say, "Why don't you do anything for me?" I want you, and these churches represented here, to be the person in that room that says, "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. You're out of the room now. It's going to be okay." And that's what you get to do when you do crisis intervention. I can't believe that you've sat and listened from 7 till 9:15, people talking, and you've been so kind to listen so closely. I hope, my prayer is that something in you is being stirred, and that you're becoming a little more excited about serving this relational, mysterious, good, redeeming God of ours. And that you sense that He's called for you to be more than just a hearer of the word, but a doer as well. Let's pray, and we'll be finished for the night. Father, teach us to be good listeners. Teach us to offer the dignity that you offer us. Teach us to offer truth that you offer. Teach us to believe the wild, extravagant truth of your grace, the wild, extravagant truth of your pursuit of us, and let that, and Father, would it be that you would be so kind that you would invite us to be a part of such grand stories as this. So Father, use this time, use these stories, and use them in the powerful name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Before we go, I want to tell you I started a story, I said a prayer, I told a bunch of stories, I said a prayer, and then I tell one more story and we're done. I just want you to know that Jesus didn't save you to use you. He saved you because he loves you. He doesn't need you to do disaster relief. But you need to do it, because if you don't, you just live your life for things that don't matter. Just one last Skylar story, and then we'll be done. I'm not a very handy person. I don't do any of the man tasks. I don't fix things, make things, or kill things. I don't do any of the man tasks. And so our house is kind of just a nasty mess of things that are broken. And so our front door, our doorknob was broken. And I decided, how hard can this be? And what would have taken you an hour to do and you an hour to do, just if I'd been by myself, it'd probably take me about 2 hours. It's not that hard. You take the back thing off and you pull 2 screws out and you pull the thing out and you just put it back in. And so it would have taken me about 2 hours, but Skylar wanted to help me. And so what would have taken you an hour, me 2 hours, now with Skylar's help, we're into about a 4-hour job. He grabbed the screws and he runs off with them, and I go back through the house and we need those screws back, son. We got to have the screws. He's got a hammer and he's hitting the back of the door with it, and he's taking stuff. And the first time we fixed it, we built it wrong so that it was one of these sort of, it's a handle door instead of the doorknob. And I put it on backwards so that it went up. And so it's like, so you have to pull the whole thing back off, and you know what I mean? You understand what I mean? So I'm not very handy. So an hour job for you, a 2-hour job for me. With Skylar, it's a 4-hour job. We finish. Mona comes home. Skylar sticks out his chest. He goes, look what we did. This is him now, I fixed the door. Now the truth is, it would have been easier to do the door without him. But he needed to be about his Father's business to give him purpose in life, to make his life matter. Remember when the Pharisees said to Jesus, they said, get these people to shut up. And Jesus says, I could get the rocks to sing my praises. He doesn't need you to do this. He's inviting you to do this. Not because if you don't do it, it won't get done. He can do it himself. But you need to do something with your life that matters. You need to do something than just sit around and debate. You need to be... He wants you to go to bed at night sometimes with your fingers dirty with the dust and the dirt of the kingdom of God on it. Not because he has to have you do it, but because a sovereign God wants to invite you into his domain to do things that matter. Because people without purpose die, people with purpose live. And he offers you purpose. So with that, it's been such a pleasure. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll get together tomorrow.